It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This is it, the 250th episode of Monster Mondays. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I'm not sure there is any more important horror film to discuss for this landmark episode than one that is very nearly 50 years old on the dot and has recently had a sequel hit the theaters just a few days ago, The Exorcist. Now, The Exorcist is widely known as the scariest movie ever made. But here's the thing about that nickname. It's actually kind of hotly debated by people these days. Like anything else, it's subjective. Some people prefer Halloween or The Shining or a zombie movie or Paranormal Activity or what have you. If that's you, that's fine. Personally, I do find this movie to be exceptionally scary and disturbing, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Why this movie went from being made on a budget of $12 million to being a massive box office success, raising nearly $430 million worldwide when adjusting for inflation, has multiple reasons. It's possible no one of these reasons has a majority or more than a marginal lead over any other. First, the movie really did scare people real bad. I mean, think about what people in 1931 might have thought when they saw Dracula or Frankenstein for the first time. Both of those movies became hits because people were titillated and returned for more because it frightened them. Today, it seems kind of tame, but then, big time Scaresville. Same with The Exorcist. You know, younger generations may not fully understand how unsettling it is for 1973 and 74 audiences to see the monster be an innocent and happy-go-lucky little girl. And on top of that, makeup maestro Dick Smith made teenager Linda Blair look downright ghastly. What's even more than that is the actual content of the movie itself. In 1973, people weren't used to seeing possessed people being turned demonic. They certainly weren't used to seeing little Reagan McNeil do some of the more sacrilegious stuff in the movie. Linda Blair also goes through angiography in a scene. It's not a comfortable procedure, and Linda Blair actually went through it for realism. It's loaded with an almost intense onslaught of terrifying and uncomfortable imagery. That scared the hell out of people. Another reason why this movie was a big deal was because it was actually a very good movie. It was directed by William Friedkin, who had already won an Academy Award for The French Connection, so it had pedigree. Granted, the movie went over budget, and aside from Friedkin, there weren't really any other major names at the time attached to the movie. They actually underestimated how it would do at the box office, they being Warner Brothers. When crowds show up and some critics raved, the movie grew and grew. Then when the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated The Exorcist for 10 Oscars, well, more and more people needed to see what it was all about. The Exorcist was also the third film that received an X rating to get a Best Picture nomination. Now, keep in mind, the most obvious thing that stands out about the overflowing number of Oscar nominations, The Exorcist is a horror movie. That trumps its ratings, as horror movies hadn't really had a lot of critical appreciation behind them since those early Universal classics and probably the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde film starring Frederick March. Sure, some horror films would get some good reviews, but nothing that placed those particular films into what can be described as levels that it had it compared with the top of the line dramas of its year. So to this day, horror is often underrepresented at the Oscars, so much so that the official prevailing thought is that Silence of the Lambs and The Shape of Water are the only two horror films to win Best Picture. I would not uniquely classify either as horror. Lambs is more of a thriller, and Water is a fantasy that happens to have a fish monster in it. But maybe the one thing that has long followed the movie is something that isn't all that true, really. Some people believe the events of The Exorcist were actually based on true events. That's only partially true. It is true that writer William Peter Blatty was inspired by a few different more real stories. The titular Exorcist was based on a British archaeologist who excavated caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Blatty had met him and based the Marin character after him. But the actual story about the possession was based on a 1949 exorcism performed by a Jesuit priest on a small boy in the St. Louis area. But that inspiration, through the usual word of mouth and games of telephone, became the urban legend, I guess is the best way to put it, that the more contemporary and actual events of The Exorcist were based on something real. I guess when I say it like that, it creates a whole other can of worms to explore. But one of the key elements of The Exorcist is the innate belief of good versus evil in a more religious, spiritual, or biblical sense. That you have to believe there are actual forces outside our ability to see or necessarily understand that battle over the souls of mortals. That's been a part of horror from day one, but when you place it in this kind of religious context, it really gets to the core of a lot of folks. But before we get into what it's all about, I am only going to talk about the original theatrical cut of The Exorcist. The director's cut is about 10 minutes longer. It does add to the ending, and it reinserts the famous spider walk scene that is frankly spooky and unnerving, but doesn't really add all that much to what made the movie so good in the first place. So I just decided to go for the original theatrical version. And that begins in northern Iraq with Catholic priest Lancaster Marin, who is also by trade an archaeologist. He discovers a medallion of St. Joseph and something that represents an ancient demon named Pazuzu. Now, Pazuzu is a fictional thing that writer William Peter Blatty took from ancient mythology of the Middle East. It's thought of as the king of the demons of the wind, and it's a creature with wings. It has like eagle or hawk talons for feet. It has the body of a man, but the head of either a lion or a dog. It also has a scorpion's tail. And it also has a snake for a ding-dong. But anyway, Pazuzu is a big deal. And before Marin leaves for Iraq, leaves Iraq to go home back to New York, he comes face to face with a large statue of the demon. This solemn confrontation of an old priest who was unnaturally aged by an exorcism earlier in life, and the statue representing the evil of the entire film, sets the stage for what will come by the end of the movie. Now from here, the movie transitions to Georgetown in the District of Columbia. We meet Ellen Burstyn's character, Chris McNeil. She's an actress working on a movie here in and around the nation's capital. She's poring over a script when she hears peculiar flapping and scratching sounds, and she checks on her preteen daughter, Reagan, played by Linda Blair, and she's sleeping with the window open. The next morning, Chris tells the handyman that she heard rats in the attic, but he swears there are no rats in this house. But after filming for the day is done, Chris comes home to see Reagan and nanny Sharon. Now, despite being a single parent, it seems as though Chris and Reagan have a really nice life. Of course, she's an actress and can afford to have Reagan be watched by a nanny. And Reagan seems to almost be charmed of sorts as she talks about meeting someone with a beautiful horse who let her ride it all around with seemingly no objections. Now, someone who doesn't have a charmed life is Jesuit priest Dr. Damien Karras. He was once a boxer, but now in the priesthood. He serves as a counselor and mentor and psychiatrist for other Georgetown priests, but he struggles with his faith. He visits his very old and pretty sick mother, who lives in a very bad part of New York City. And he wants to take her to a home where she can be better taken care of and not so lonely while he works and does his priest things down in Georgetown. But she refuses. When she soon dies, Karras is left feeling extremely guilty for not doing more to help her, as he mixes that with his crisis of faith. This leads to him having nightmares about his mother, a medallion like the one that Marin found in Iraq, and gets quick flashes of a demonic face. Meanwhile, Regan attributes those strange noises her mother hears at night to her imaginary friend, Captain Howdy. Now, the good captain can only be communicated with via Ouija board. That's great. But on her birthday, Regan's father fails to call her, leaving Chris particularly pissed off. And it creates an additional bad energy in the house. A call wakes Chris up in the middle of the night, where she is talking to her director friend about the next day's shoot, and she finds Regan sleeping next to her and complaining that her bed was shaking. The growling and scratching in the attic only gets worse, and soon Regan's behavior starts to change. This also coincides with a particularly gnarly desecration of a statue of Mary at a local church, and Karras' mother needing to be sent to the hospital for the infirm and emotionally unwell. And once she gets home, she eventually dies alone after kind of having a contentious final visit from Father Karras. It's like a darkness is starting to come over the world and the characters of note in the movie. And this is punctuated at a house party thrown by Chris at her townhouse, where after going to bed and later Regan comes downstairs in the waning moments of the party, announces to one of the guests that he's going to die up there, and then urinates on the floor. After bathing her and putting Regan back to bed, Chris witnesses Regan's bed bucking and tossing her about. After a battery of tests run on Regan, the doctor does find a lesion in the temporal lobe that can cause hallucinations and other destructive behavior. So he suggests that they find the lesion and ultimately fix it. And I should mention that Chris even explains that she too was on the bed when it was bouncing about. But the doctor just kind of tosses that to the side and says that it's not her bed, but it's Regan's brain that's broken. However, when the doctor orders the angiography be done on Regan, nothing is found. Chris then calls the doctor to say that Regan is in a pretty bad way and she's bouncing on the bed, and soon a bulge forms in her throat and she starts screaming at the doctor to fuck her. They eventually hold her down and sedate her, and eventually the doctor can only recommend a psychiatrist. Meanwhile, Chris comes home to find Regan alone and her window open. After Sharon returns home, she tells Chris that her director friend Burke was watching Regan while she went and picked up a prescription. Burke, a notorious drunk, was soon found dead after falling down a steep set of stairs outside of Regan's window. His head was found completely turned around backwards. But Kinderman, the detective looking into the death, thinks that this is not something that happened in the fall and had to have had happened separately somehow, either before or after. There's something of a rich witchcraft-style way that body was found, and there's a black mass style of desecration of that statue of Mary at that church. And Kinderman is trying to piece things together. Now, over the days and weeks, Regan is becoming more violent and her face is covered by cuts and scratches. She's observed by literally a dozen doctors. They land on the concept of something seen in other countries called somnambulist possession. And finally, at the halfway mark of the movie, the doctors basically throw their hands up and suggest that maybe she seek help from the church. Chris is reluctant, as she is at best non-religious and perhaps even an atheist. And soon Kinderman visits the McNeils asking about Burke's death, and he feels he had to be pushed out of the window for his body to have ended up in the state that it was in and die in the fall down the stairwell. Chris is able to keep Kinderman from talking to Regan, but It's immediately after Kinderman leaves that the most famous scene of The Exorcist happens, and maybe one of the most famous scenes in any horror movie ever happens. Regan is heard screaming while another voice is heard from her room. When Chris gets to her room, she finds Regan violently masturbating with a crucifix while things fly all around the room. Regan then grabs Chris's head and pulls it into her crotch before throwing her down and nearly crushing her with a dresser that she's moving with her mind, basically. And Regan's head turns around backwards and with Burke's voice basically tells Chris that Regan killed him. Now, Chris has to go to the church. She meets with Father Karras, but he only agrees to potentially investigate this as a possession because Chris is at her wit's end. He doesn't really believe Regan to be possessed. It's not something the Catholic Church will approve either. And on top of that, Regan identifies herself as the devil. That's not common in possession. She's good at impersonating someone who Karras saw in New York, but she can't really give him his mother's maiden name when she says that his mother is with Regan's inside her body, which is essentially a metaphor for being in hell. She basically only, when he presses her for his mother's maiden name, Regan only throws up on him with projectile thick green goo. However, Regan didn't know a priest was coming to see her, nor that the priest's mother had recently passed away. Karras reluctantly continues investigating and reading up on what he needs to provide for this to be approved for the rite of exorcism. She does speak some different languages that she probably shouldn't know all that well, but when he hits her with holy water, she has a particularly violent reaction that makes noises that he recognizes as backwards talk. However, the water was just tap water, and all signs point to him not having what the church would need to approve the rite. But when he listens to the recording he took of her talking backwards, he hears the name of Marin. It seems that Regan wants the priest Marin, and late that night, Karras is brought to Regan's room where he's shown the words "help me" appearing on her stomach like they are welts coming from within. Karras gets approval that exorcism is indeed warranted. His boss suggests an experienced priest. That priest who will lead the exorcism is none other than Lancaster Marin. And Marin arrives on a foggy night, and when he gets inside the McNeils, Regan screams Marin's name. Marin doesn't even need the background of the case. He prepares Karras by telling him that the demon is a liar, basically don't listen to it, and just stay with the right and stay with him. Karras tries explaining what he thinks, or that he thinks there are three personalities present, but Marin corrects him saying there's only one, the demon. As the rite begins, Regan spits orange goop onto Marin's face. She lifts the bed and rocks it around in protest. She tells Karras that his mother sucks cocks in hell. When she lifts her bed off the floor a few feet, Karras starts to kind of break a little, but Marin kind of gets him back on task. And as the interaction escalates, she causes the walls and ceilings to crack and her binds basically tear off, keeping her in the bed. Now that she's free, she's able to levitate her body off the bed by several feet until the priests are able to bring her back to the bed. Things get pretty physical when she knocks them both to the floor and Marin sees her with the statue of Pazuzu. Once Regan falls asleep again, they decide to take a break, but it's been a rough go of it. Marin is clearly not doing well health-wise. Karras is shaken rather deeply about what he's witnessed. The demon keeps trying to trick Karras by impersonating his mother. Marin excuses Karras, but he returns to the room after Chris sees him in the foyer and asks him if Regan's going to die. And when Karras gets back to the room, Marin is dead, and Regan is freed again from her bonds. When she giggles at what she's done, Karis attacks and demands the demon possess him. Soon, Regan begins crying now that she's free from the demon's hold, and Karis wants to attack, but decides to throw himself out the window and tumble down the stairs, killing himself. So let's get to the three things that I like about William Friedkin and William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist. First, I think the opening of this movie is often unfairly forgotten. While yes, the image of Linda Blair being possessed and turning from a sweet and innocent little girl into a literal monster throughout the course of her possession is rightly what should be conjured up when the title is muttered by somebody. However, there is a lot going on in the early scenes with Max von Sydow in Iraq. He's a Catholic priest working with what I have to assume is mostly Muslim partners and excavators that assist him. And he seems to be appropriately respected as well as respect those he works with. He doesn't speak a single line of dialogue, but we know a lot about him when we first see him. He's been through the fire, so to speak. He's old, but also still has an inquisitive mind. Thus, why it seems that he's in the desert. His hands shake and his feet are unsteady, and it's very clear that he takes heart medicine. He does not seem scared of evil, but he's haunted by something from his past. He doesn't simply cower or be concerned with the concept of the iconography of Pazuzu, even when dogs fight near the statue that he sees before he leaves Iraq. He knows the world has evil in it. He's seen it. He's fought it. It's a great, wordless, and kind of eerie scene that sets the stage without really needing to feed it to you. Next, when things start to get a little hairy for Regan, I like that the movie doesn't just immediately jump to supernatural explanations. Movies prior to this, and smaller movies and movies that weren't quite as taken as seriously, did jump to supernatural things relatively quickly, especially in Gothic horror, as it was a very easy way to explain why, oh, that's a vampire over there. We need to assume vampires are real, so we need to go fight it. But in The Exorcist, there are attempts to find medical reasons behind why she's acting weird. They even have explanations about how adrenaline likely causes her to bounce around on top of her bed. If they can't find the lesions that cause the change in her behavior, then maybe it's drugs that Chris has around the house. And if it's not that, then maybe it's psychological, and so on and so forth. The movie is handled in a very modern, at least in the terms of the early 70s, way as possible. Honestly, what leads to the need of an exorcist is something that is a little more emotional. The mother's need to help her daughter. It's the emotion that leads to the leap of faith that Chris has to take. But even then, that's still handled in a very modern way, as she only goes to that point after exhausting all other sensible, quote-unquote, options. Hell, Karis doesn't even think exorcism is proper. In addition, when he studies Regan, he hears her speaking in tongues, but it's just backwards English. All this works, but it also doesn't necessarily lead to the McNeils becoming overly religious by the end of it either. Regan does seem to have an emotional connection to seeing Father Dyer at the end of the movie, which was one of Father Karras's friends. But Regan doesn't really know what happened, so she doesn't have any reason to think, oh, I was saved by priests, so therefore I must become a Catholic or I must become religious. I mean, Chris only knows something absolutely crazy happened, and she needed to put her faith in the people who had the proper faith to battle the possession. It's funny how this is a movie in which religion is necessary to defeat evil, but it can be watched with religion at arm's length. And thirdly, there's a whole lot about The Exorcist to like. It handles horror in a serious way that was, up to this point, rarely seen. it allows you to watch the movie from multiple perspectives that include both the agnostic and the religious. It's paced exceptionally well. It's a layered movie that deals with supernatural, a murder, a mother trying to help her daughter, the modern reliance on science and medicine, guilt, faith, so on and so forth. There's a lot of things going on here. Holy cow, is the makeup good. Max von Sydow was younger than I was when he made this movie. However, this old man makeup that he was wearing may be the most convincing ever seen in film. And as a few decades later, we actually did see him really look like what he looked like in The Exorcist as a real old man. Linda Blair's makeup is some of the scariest ever done too. In fact, the way she looks when she's fully possessed is something that burns into my head. It's a visage I don't want to see at night. I really don't want to see it appear over my shoulder when I turn the light on and look in the bathroom mirror late at night. But the performances really is what drives this movie. Ellen Burstyn is great as a mother who is equally unhinged but also fiercely fighting for her daughter, a daughter she knows killed her friend. Max von Sydow is stoic and great. Actually, his presence in this movie is so iconic that it creates not only the title of the book and the movie, but also the poster to the movie as he arrives on that fateful foggy night and looks up into the window that is where Reagan is. But the best performance in the entire movie, though, belongs to Jason Miller as Father Karras. He has to carry a massive burden of being someone who has to go through the motions of his religion and standing as a priest, but also has this crisis of faith. He's also handling the guilt of not being there for his mother when she died and not doing more for her. However, he also is the guy who has to decide to help another mother who is fighting for her daughter's life. He's compelled to be a hero to save a little girl by literally throwing himself at the problem and sacrificing himself in the end. It's a really good performance for a guy who was making his movie debut and best known for being a playwright up to that time that he got the role as Karras. But before we end this episode, I think it's really important to discuss the legacy of The Exorcist and how it affected and influenced horror since its release. Beyond how it immediately influenced other possession films, The Exorcist had a far more reaching influence on the genre. It's obvious. The obvious thing is how makeup effects and gore jumped to new heights. Dick Smith would influence other greats like Rick Baker and Tom Savini. The artistry of effects would continue to push the envelope for gore and become more and more realistic in the years that followed. I mentioned Max von Sydow's makeup. I mentioned Linda Blair's makeup, but I want to make sure I mention this again. The way Linda Blair looks is something that while watching the movie is cool, I don't ever like seeing that face of hers under her possessed makeup in any context outside of the movie, especially at night. It's so good. It literally gives me the heebie-jeebies. It makes my skin crawl. It's also one of the movies that has an iconic piece of music that serves as its theme song. Tubular Bells was the name of an album that was written by Mike Oldfield. If I understand this correctly, the album Tubular Bells was essentially an opus that was comprised of two larger pieces of music, side A and side B. When it was released a couple of months after the release of The Exorcist as a single, the piece that plays in The Exorcist became known as Tubular Bells, parentheses, the theme from The Exorcist. It's a piece of music that once it's associated with the movie it's best known for, it immediately becomes recognizable and always draws your gaze over to the movie it came from, in this case, The Exorcist. It's like the theme from Halloween or the James Bond theme or the Mission Impossible theme or the theme from the Big Pink Panther. It's so perfectly matched to its movie. But maybe the biggest impact The Exorcist had was it helped legitimize the genre. 5 years earlier, Rosemary's Baby started making horror seem like something a little more than vampires and werewolves and mummies and other ghastly ghouls and monsters. But between that film, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, and The Exorcist, people started seeing that perhaps horror did have something to it that could be taken seriously. And especially something, it was a genre that you could say things in and could express things in almost a counterculture sort of way. And after those 10 Oscar nominations, more notable actors and actresses were finding their way over to horror. The realization of its full potential as a serious genre was probably actually The Silence of the Lambs, that while I would rather consider it a thriller as opposed to straight horror, finally won the Oscars The Exorcist couldn't. Of course, its reputation of being the scariest movie ever made meant that it would be shown on cable and rented at video stores, and became even more popular that way. And that also influenced other filmmakers who would also make horror films as well. Now, regardless if you think The Exorcist is the scariest movie ever made, or lame, or a well-made legitimate drama as well as horror, or you think it's boring, whatever it is that you think, there are few movies more important to its genre over the last 50 years than The Exorcist is to horror. And that wraps up this week's 250th episode of Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, Monster Mondays takes a look at another popular film from the 70s, also supposedly inspired by real-life events, with the Amityville Horror. Until next week, stay spooky.